Some dogs remember the dead better than the living do. The kennel lights at Fort Braddock Military Base dimmed automatically at 2:13 a.m., leaving only a weak strip of yellow light humming above the isolation corridor where the retired K-9 slept. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the chain-link fences, and wind rolled through the compound carrying the smell of wet concrete, diesel, and pine from the hills beyond the highway. Most nights were quiet here. Old dogs slept. Handlers drank stale coffee. Nobody expected miracles anymore. But tonight, something moved in the dark. Sergeant Ethan Cole looked up from the security monitor the moment he heard it. Scratching. Slow at first, then desperate. Metal against concrete. He frowned and pushed back from the desk. What the hell? The hallway beyond the office was cold enough to sting his lungs. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead as he followed the sound deeper into the retired K-9 wing, boots echoing softly through the corridor. The scratching stopped. Silence swallowed the building again. Ethan tightened his jaw and reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt. Then came a low whine. Old. Weak. Familiar. He rounded the final corner and froze. Blood streaked faintly across the kennel floor. Not fresh enough to panic him, just enough to tell a story. And sitting in the center of the corridor, trembling beneath the pale light, was Rex. The German Shepherd's sable coat had gone silver around the muzzle with age. Rain soaked through his fur in uneven patches, and one paw dragged slightly against the concrete as though the long walk back had taken everything left in him. But it wasn't the blood or the shaking that made Ethan's chest tighten. It was what hung from Rex's mouth. A rusted military dog tag. Ethan stepped closer carefully, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the storm outside. Rex, the dog lifted his head slowly. Amber eyes clouded by age locked onto Ethan's face with exhausted determination. Then Rex placed the tag gently at Ethan's boots. The metal clinked once against the floor. Ethan crouched. His fingers hesitated before turning the tag over beneath the flashlight beam. Captain Daniel Hayes. U.S. Marine Corps. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. Rain hammered harder against the roof. 8 years. 8 years since Operation Black Ridge. 8 years since the explosion in the mountains outside Kandahar swallowed half their K-9 unit in smoke and fire. 8 years since Captain Daniel Hayes was officially declared dead. Ethan remembered the folded flag, the empty coffin, the silence afterward. He remembered Rex barking for 3 straight nights after they brought the dog back alone. That's impossible, Ethan whispered. But Rex let out a low sound deep in his chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry. More like insistence. Ethan noticed then that the dog's paws were packed with snow and mud. Fresh snow. Montana snow by the smell of pine and frozen earth clinging to his fur. Rex hadn't wandered here by accident. He had come from somewhere. Or from someone. The old shepherd suddenly staggered sideways. Ethan caught him before he hit the concrete. Rex's body felt thinner than he remembered, fragile beneath the wet fur. But the dog still pressed his nose urgently against Ethan's sleeve as if trying to pull him toward something only he could see. Then the security lights flickered once, twice, and somewhere far beyond the kennel walls, a helicopter echoed through the storm. Rex's ears lifted instantly, the same way they used to whenever Captain Hayes came home. The storm deepened over Fort Braddock before dawn, wrapping the old K-9 compound in a cold gray haze that blurred the floodlights into pale halos. Ethan Cole sat alone inside the security office with Rex lying beside the heater vent, his breathing uneven but calmer now. A wool blanket covered the old German shepherd's back, though the dog still trembled in his sleep every few minutes, as if running through memories his body could no longer escape. The rusted dog tag rested on the desk beside Ethan's coffee cup. Captain Daniel Hayes. Ethan must have read the name 50 times already, hoping repetition might make it less impossible. It did not. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, wet fur, and burnt coffee grounds. Somewhere outside, a gate rattled in the wind. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face and stared through the rain-speckled window toward the kennel yard. Most of the retired dogs slept through the night without making a sound. Not Rex. Never Rex. Even after all these years, the old shepherd reacted to helicopters, diesel engines, and the crackling static of military radios. Some wounds did not bleed. They echoed. Rex suddenly lifted his head. his ears angled toward the television mounted in the corner of the office where muted local news flickered across the screen. Ethan reached for the remote and turned up the volume slightly. Heavy snowfall continues across western Montana tonight, the anchorwoman said calmly. State troopers are advising residents near Bitterroot Ridge to avoid back roads after several emergency calls reported power outages and dangerous conditions. The moment the words Bitterroot Ridge filled the room, Rex stood up. Fast. Too fast for an old dog with aching joints. His nails scraped against the concrete floor as he moved toward the screen, staring at the snowy image with complete focus. Ethan felt a chill move slowly beneath his skin. You know that place, do not you? Rex let out a low sound in his throat. Not aggressive. Certain. Ethan leaned back in his chair, memories surfacing whether he wanted them or not. Bitterroot Ridge. Daniel used to talk about it during deployment. Said if he ever made it out of the Corps alive, he wanted a cabin somewhere quiet where the snow buried the noise of the world. Ethan remembered laughing about it once over cheap coffee in Afghanistan while sandstorms rattled the camp walls. You hate the cold, Ethan had told him back then. Daniel had smiled faintly and scratched behind Rex's ears. Yeah, he said, but silence sounds different in the snow. Ethan swallowed hard. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. Rex moved closer suddenly and pressed his nose against Ethan's hand with urgent persistence. Then the old shepherd limped toward the office door. Easy boy. Rex looked back immediately. Waiting. Ethan stood slowly. You are trying to tell me he is alive. The dog's amber eyes never left his face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Ethan looked down again at the dog tag resting beneath the desk lamp. Rainwater still clung to its edges. Fresh. Not 8 years old. Fresh. His heartbeat quickened. Military records did not disappear by accident. Men did not stay officially dead unless somebody wanted them forgotten. Ethan walked to the filing cabinet against the wall and unlocked the bottom drawer with an old brass key. Inside sat sealed operational archives from Black Ridge. Files nobody had touched in years. Dust coated the folders like frost. Rex stepped closer as Ethan pulled the first folder free. The old shepherd's tail remained still, but his breathing changed the moment the paper opened. There it was. Operation Black Ridge. Status, classified. Ethan stared at the blacked-out pages beneath the flickering fluorescent light while the storm pressed harder against the building. Then one line near the bottom caught his eye. Survivor status unresolved. The clock above the kennel office read 3:47 a.m. when Ethan finally sat down again, but the exhaustion behind his eyes had vanished completely. The classified folder remained open across the desk beneath the harsh fluorescent light, pages covered in black redactions and faded military stamps that smelled faintly of old paper and dust. Rex stayed close beside him, lying on the cold concrete floor with his head resting against Ethan's boot as though guarding the truth hidden inside the file. Outside, the storm softened into steady snowfall. Thick white flakes drifted through the security lights, quieting the entire base beneath a blanket of silence. Ethan turned another page carefully. Most of the report was useless now. Coordinates blacked out. Names erased. Entire paragraphs removed with thick, dark lines. But some details remained. K-9 reconnaissance team. Mountain terrain east of Kandahar. Weather complications. Communication failure. Survivor extraction incomplete. Ethan's jaw tightened. Incomplete. Not failed. Not terminated. Incomplete. He leaned back slowly, hearing Daniel's voice in his head the way it sounded years ago during deployment. Calm. Steady. The kind of voice that made frightened Marines breathe easier during bad nights overseas. Daniel Hayes never panicked. Even under mortar alarms or sandstorms that swallowed entire roads, he carried himself like a man who believed fear only grew louder if you fed it. Rex had been the same way. Handler and dog moved like reflections of each other. Ethan remembered one freezing night outside a remote checkpoint when the generators died and the mountains disappeared into blackness. Most of the younger Marines were nervous. Visibility near zero. Radio static everywhere. But Daniel had sat beside Rex near the wire fence, one hand resting against the shepherd's neck while snow drifted quietly across their uniforms. Dogs know things before we do, Daniel said softly back then. God gives them instincts because people are too stubborn to listen. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory before the smile faded again. Rex suddenly stirred beside him. The old shepherd lifted his head sharply toward the hallway. Footsteps approached. A moment later, the office door opened, and Dr. Amelia Brooks stepped inside, carrying a medical kit tucked beneath one arm. Her long wool coat still held snow along the shoulders, and cold air followed her into the room, carrying the scent of winter pine. "I came as soon as security called," she said quietly. Then she saw Rex. Her expression changed immediately. "Good Lord." Amelia knelt beside the shepherd slowly, her gloved hand brushing carefully through the wet fur along his shoulders. Rex recognized her instantly. His tail thumped once against the floor. "Hey there, old boy," she whispered. "You look like you walked halfway across America." Ethan handed her the rusted dog tag without a word. Amelia studied it beneath the desk lamp, and the color slowly drained from her face. "That cannot be possible." "That is what I said." Silence settled between them except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the distant hum of the heating vents. Amelia looked toward the classified folder. "You opened Black Ridge?" Ethan nodded once. "Something was hidden from us." Amelia exhaled carefully, then glanced down at Rex again. Dogs do not hold on to hope this long without reason. Rex watched both of them quietly now, amber eyes reflecting the pale office light. Older, tired, but waiting, as if every mile through the snow had led to this exact moment. Amelia reached gently beneath Rex's collar to examine the skin around his neck. Then her hand stopped suddenly. "Ethan." "What?" She pulled free a small strip of faded fabric tangled beneath the old collar buckle. Military green, torn at the edge. Ethan leaned closer. Sewn into the fabric were 4 barely visible letters. DH. The initials were fresh. Snow covered Fort Braddock by sunrise, turning the old military base into a world of muted white and steel-gray silence. The retired kennel wing sat beneath layers of frost, while distant floodlights glowed weakly through the falling snow, like candles struggling against the dark. Inside the office, nobody spoke for several seconds after Amelia revealed the initials stitched into the fabric beneath Rex's collar. D.H. Fresh thread. Recently sewn. Ethan stared at the cloth strip resting in Amelia's gloved palm, while his pulse thudded heavily in his ears. "That did not come from 8 years ago," Amelia whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. "No." Rex remained still between them, watching with quiet patience as though he had already solved the mystery long before the humans had caught up. The old shepherd's breathing rattled softly now, exhaustion settling deeper into his body after the long journey through the storm. Amelia carefully checked his injured paw under the desk lamp, while Ethan returned to the classified file. There had to be something they missed. Something hidden between the blacked-out reports and official lies. He flipped through the remaining pages faster now. Weather conditions. Mission failure. Personnel unrecovered. Then another page stopped him cold. Transfer authorization denied. Survivor containment protocol initiated. Ethan frowned hard. Containment. Amelia looked up immediately. What does that mean? Ethan scanned the paragraph again, but half the page had been redacted. Only fragments remained visible beneath the dark bars. Cognitive trauma. Relocation recommended. Identity suppression for operational security. Ethan felt the room turn colder around him. "They found him," he said quietly. "After Black Ridge, they found Daniel alive." Amelia sat back slowly beside Rex. "Then why declare him dead?" Ethan did not answer right away because somewhere deep inside, he already knew the truth military men learned too often. Sometimes war buried people long before the ground ever did. Outside, the wind rattled against the kennel fencing again. Rex suddenly pushed himself upright despite the pain in his joints. His ears lifted toward the office television where the morning weather report continued flashing warnings across the screen. Bitterroot County. Whiteout conditions. Emergency closures. The shepherd stared at the map intensely. Ethan followed his gaze. "Montana. That is where he is," Ethan murmured. Rex let out a soft sound low in his chest. "Certain again." Amelia rose slowly and crossed her arms against the cold. "If Daniel survived severe trauma and they relocated him somewhere isolated," she stopped, "he may not even remember who he is anymore." Ethan looked down at Rex. "But this dog does." The old shepherd limped toward the office door once more. Waiting. The same stubborn determination military handlers always admired in working dogs. No panic. No confusion. Just purpose. Ethan remembered training exercises years ago where Rex would continue tracking scents through freezing rain long after younger dogs gave up. Daniel used to kneel beside him afterward and whisper the same words every single time. Good soldiers finish the walk. Ethan closed the classified folder carefully. I need transportation. Amelia blinked. You are serious? Look at him. Ethan gestured toward Rex. This dog crossed states in the middle of winter carrying a dead man's dog tag. He did not come here to rest. Silence settled softly over the room again. Amelia looked at Rex for a long moment before her expression finally softened. Then he is asking you to follow him. Ethan grabbed his coat from the back of the chair while snow continued piling against the windows outside. The storm was getting worse. Roads into Montana would be dangerous by noon. But Rex was already standing near the door despite the tremble in his legs, waiting like he had been waiting for 8 long years. Then suddenly the hallway speakers crackled overhead with a burst of static. Ethan froze when an old recorded security code echoed faintly through the building. Authorization voice recognized. Captain Daniel Hayes. Rex's ears shot upward instantly. By 6:10 a.m., the storm had swallowed the roads beyond Fort Braddock completely. Snow drifted across the empty parking lot in thick, white waves while freezing wind pushed against the kennel buildings hard enough to rattle the old windows in their frames. Ethan loaded supplies into the back of his aging Ford pickup beneath the pale glow of the security lights. Blankets, flashlights, fuel cans, medical supplies Amelia insisted they take. The truck smelled faintly of motor oil, leather, and old coffee, the familiar scent of long military winters. Rex sat quietly in the passenger seat watching every movement through the frosted windshield. The old German shepherd looked exhausted now that the adrenaline had faded, but his eyes never lost focus. Somewhere beyond the storm, he knew exactly where he needed to go. Amelia stepped carefully through the snow carrying a thermos wrapped in a scarf. Her dark hair disappeared beneath a wool cap, and her cheeks had gone pink from the bitter cold. You should wait until the road's clear, she said softly as Ethan secured the final bag in the truck bed. Ethan shook his head once. If Daniel is alive out there alone in this weather, waiting could kill him. Amelia handed him the thermos. Then at least promise me one thing. What? She glanced toward Rex inside the truck. Listen to the dog. Ethan looked through the windshield where Rex sat upright, ears forward despite the fatigue pulling at his aging body. I think that is exactly what we should have done 8 years ago. The wind howled across the base as Ethan climbed behind the wheel. Snow crunched beneath the tires when the truck finally rolled toward the front gate. Rex shifted immediately, nose pressed toward the glass, watching the road ahead with growing intensity. Fort Braddock disappeared behind them slowly beneath the storm. The farther they drove into the mountains, the quieter the world became. Pine forests stretched endlessly beneath heavy snowfall, while telephone lines sagged beneath ice along the roadside. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly as the truck crawled north through Montana's frozen back roads. The heater rattled weakly against the cold. Old country music hummed low through static on the radio before fading completely into silence. Rex remained awake the entire drive. Every few miles, the shepherd would lift his head sharply and stare toward the trees as though checking invisible landmarks only he could understand. Around noon the storm worsened. Snow swept across the highway, so heavily Ethan could barely see 20 feet ahead. He slowed near an abandoned gas station buried beneath drifts of white. The building looked forgotten by time itself, windows boarded over, gas pumps frozen solid beneath layers of ice. Ethan killed the engine for a moment and listened. Wind. Silence. Then Rex suddenly growled softly deep in his throat. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan turned slowly toward the dog. Rex was staring toward the side of the building where a narrow path disappeared into the woods. Fresh footprints crossed the snow there. Human footprints. Ethan stepped out carefully into the freezing wind, boots sinking several inches into fresh powder. The cold bit instantly through his gloves. Rex jumped down beside him despite the limp in his injured paw and moved toward the trail with urgent determination. Ethan followed. Pine branches groaned overhead beneath the weight of snow while the forest swallowed the sound of the highway behind them. The footprints continued deeper between the trees. Recent. Less than a day old. Ethan's heartbeat quickened beneath his coat. Daniel, he called once into the white silence. No answer came. only wind moving through the pines like distant whispers. Then Rex stopped abruptly beside a fallen log half buried in snow. The shepherd lowered his nose carefully toward the ground before letting out a low, trembling whine. Ethan stepped closer and felt his stomach tighten. Resting against the log beneath fresh snow sat an old metal canteen stamped with faded military initials, D.H., and beside it lay a single handwritten note sealed inside a plastic bag. The paper contained only 4 words. "Stop looking for me." The note trembled slightly between Ethan's gloved fingers as snow drifted silently through the trees around him. "Stop looking for me." 4 simple words. No signature. No explanation. But Ethan recognized the handwriting immediately. Daniel always pressed too hard with pens, the letters sharp and uneven like they had been carved instead of written. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared at the paper while cold wind pushed through the forest in slow, hollow waves. Rex remained beside the fallen log, nose lifted toward the deeper woods beyond the trail. Waiting again, Ethan folded the note carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "You found him, did not you?" he whispered softly to the old shepherd. Rex glanced back once, amber eyes clouded with age and exhaustion, then turned toward the mountains ahead. The dog did not bark. He did not hesitate. He simply started walking. Ethan followed. Snow crunched beneath their boots and paws as the forest thickened around them. Pine branches hung low beneath heavy frost, and the scent of cedar and frozen earth filled the air with the clean, sharp smell only winter carried. Hours passed beneath the gray Montana sky, while the storm slowly weakened into drifting snowflakes that shimmered faintly in the pale afternoon light. Rex kept moving despite the limp in his front paw. Sometimes he paused to catch his breath, chest rising heavily. But the moment Ethan suggested turning back, the old shepherd pressed forward again with stubborn determination. It reminded Ethan painfully of Daniel himself. Neither one ever knew how to quit. As daylight faded, the trail narrowed near the edge of a frozen creek winding through the mountains. Ethan noticed signs now that someone had been surviving out here alone for a long time. Freshly chopped firewood stacked beneath a tarp. Fishing line tied carefully between trees. Boot tracks leading toward higher ground. Human life hidden quietly beneath the wilderness. Rex suddenly stopped near the creek bank. His ears lifted. Then he let out the softest whine Ethan had heard since leaving Fort Braddock. Ethan looked up. A cabin stood half-concealed among the pines roughly 50 yards ahead. Small, weathered, smoke drifting faintly from the chimney into the evening sky. Warm light glowed behind frosted windows. Ethan felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. After 8 years of memorial services, folded flags, and silence, there it was. Proof. Daniel Hayes was alive. Rex took one step forward, then another slower one after that. His tail moved carefully behind him, uncertain now for the first time during the entire journey. Ethan understood immediately. The old shepherd was afraid. Not of danger. Of rejection. "Easy, partner," Ethan whispered gently. Rex froze. The exact same words Daniel used to say before missions overseas. The dog's ears twitched instantly at the sound. Then the cabin door opened. A tall man stepped onto the porch carrying a lantern. His beard had gone thick with gray, and years of mountain winters had carved deep lines across his face, but Ethan recognized him immediately despite the changes. Daniel Hayes stood beneath the porch light staring into the snowstorm like a man who had seen a ghost walk out of the forest. The lantern slipped slightly in his hand. Nobody moved. Wind whispered through the pines while snow drifted softly between them. Daniel's eyes finally dropped lower toward the shepherd standing beside Ethan. Rex trembled once. Then Daniel whispered the name like a prayer he no longer believed deserved an answer. "Rex." The old German shepherd made a broken sound deep in his chest and started forward slowly through the snow. For one suspended moment, the mountains seemed to hold their breath with them. Snow drifted slowly between the cabin porch and the tree line where Rex stood trembling in the fading light. Daniel Hayes remained frozen beneath the lantern glow, his weathered face pale beneath the beard, blue eyes fixed entirely on the old German shepherd moving toward him through the snow. Ethan stayed back silently near the trees because something sacred was unfolding in front of him, something too deep for interruption. Rex limped forward one careful step at a time. Age had slowed him. Pain bent his joints. But the closer he came to Daniel, The more the years seemed to fall away from him like snow shaken from old fur. Daniel lowered the lantern slowly onto the porch floor. His hands trembled harder now. "No," he whispered under his breath, almost to himself. "No, this cannot be real." Rex stopped only a few feet away. The old shepherd stared upward with amber eyes full of exhaustion, memory, and something even older than both. Loyalty. Daniel sank slowly to his knees in the snow. For a second, he simply looked at the dog as though afraid touching him might make the vision disappear. Then his hand reached forward carefully and rested against Rex's neck. The shepherd let out a broken cry deep in his chest and pushed forward instantly, collapsing against Daniel with all the weight of 8 missing years. Daniel wrapped both arms around him. Snow clung to their clothes while the wind moved softly through the pines around the cabin. Ethan looked away for a moment because some reunions carried too much grief inside them to witness directly. Daniel buried his face into the thick fur along Rex's shoulders. "You found me," he whispered shakily. "God help me. You actually found me." Rex whined softly and licked once against Daniel's weathered hand like no time had passed at all. Daniel laughed then, but the sound cracked apart halfway through into something dangerously close to tears. Ethan had not heard that laugh since Afghanistan, before the silence got inside him. Finally, Daniel looked up toward Ethan standing near the tree line. Recognition came slowly at first, buried beneath years of isolation and memory loss. Then it landed fully in his eyes. "Ethan." Ethan stepped closer through the snow. "Yeah, brother." Daniel stared at him in disbelief. "You are older." Ethan smirked faintly despite the emotion tightening his chest. "So are you." A weak smile touched Daniel's face before fading again beneath exhaustion. Up close, Ethan could finally see what the mountains had done to him. Daniel looked thinner than he should have. His hands were rough and scarred from years of chopping wood and surviving winter alone. A faint line stretched along his temple, disappearing into silver hair beneath his knit cap. But the deepest scars sat behind his eyes. Quiet ones. The kind war left behind after the noise ended. Daniel glanced toward Rex again and gently scratched behind the shepherd's ears the exact same way he used to before missions overseas. Rex immediately leaned into the touch with a deep sigh that sounded almost human. "Relief. He never stopped waiting for you," Ethan said softly. Daniel swallowed hard and looked away toward the snowy mountains surrounding the cabin. "I tried to disappear." Wind brushed across the porch, carrying the scent of cedar, smoke, and frozen pine. Somewhere deeper in the forest, branches creaked beneath the weight of snow. Ethan stepped onto the porch slowly. "Why?" Daniel stayed silent for several long seconds. Then his eyes drifted toward the old military dog tag hanging from Rex's collar. "Because after Black Ridge," he said quietly, "they made sure I forgot who I was." Rex suddenly lifted his head sharply toward the woods behind the cabin. His ears locked forward. Alert again. The warmth inside the cabin felt strange after hours in the mountain cold. Fire crackled softly in a cast-iron stove near the far wall, while shadows flickered across rough pine boards darkened by years of smoke and winter storms. The air carried the scent of cedarwood, coffee grounds, and old paper. Rex lay stretched near the fire now, exhausted beyond movement, though his ears still twitched at every unfamiliar sound outside. Daniel sat across from Ethan at a small wooden table beneath a dim hanging light, turning a metal coffee mug slowly between both hands as though trying to remember what comfort felt like. Silence settled heavily between them for a while. Not awkward silence. Military silence. The kind shared by men who had already seen too much together. Snow tapped softly against the cabin windows. Finally, Ethan looked around the room carefully. Maps covered one section of wall beside old photographs and handwritten notes pinned with thumbtacks. Most showed mountain trails, supply routes, and weather patterns around Bitterroot Ridge. But one photograph stopped him cold. It was old and faded at the edges. A younger Daniel stood beside Rex in full Marine combat, gear somewhere overseas, one arm resting proudly across the German shepherd's shoulders while desert wind blurred the background behind them. Someone had folded the picture enough times that cracks split through the center. "You remembered him," Ethan said quietly. Daniel stared into the coffee cup for several seconds before answering. "Not at first." His voice sounded rough from years without conversation. "When they pulled me out after Black Ridge, I could barely remember my own name. The fire snapped softly nearby. Daniel rubbed a hand slowly across the scar near his temple. Doctors called it traumatic dissociation. Said parts of my memory shut down after the explosion. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. Daniel continued staring into the firelight. For months I woke up thinking I was still overseas. Every loud sound felt like incoming fire. Every nightmare started with smoke. Rex lifted his head slightly at the sound of Daniel's voice, eyes watching him from across the room. The military moved me around after recovery. Daniel continued quietly. Different hospitals, different specialists, different medications. He laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor inside it. At some point they decided disappearing me was easier than fixing me. Ethan clenched his jaw. So they buried your records. Daniel nodded faintly. Officially dead soldiers ask fewer questions. The words hung heavily in the cabin. Outside, wind swept snow against the porch again. Ethan glanced toward Rex resting near the fire. Why did he leave the cabin? Daniel looked at the old shepherd for a long moment before answering. Because he knew I was getting worse. Ethan frowned slightly. Daniel leaned back in the chair, exhaustion deep beneath his eyes now. 3 months ago I started forgetting things again. Small things first, then larger ones. His fingers tightened slightly around the mug. One morning, I could not remember Rex's command words. Rex stood slowly at the sound of his name and limped toward Daniel's chair. Daniel rested a hand gently against the shepherd's neck. That scared him. Ethan watched the old Marine carefully. And the note. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I thought if nobody found me, maybe nobody would watch me disappear a second time. The firelight flickered softly across the cabin walls. Then Rex suddenly stiffened beside Daniel's chair. Low growling rolled quietly through his chest. Ethan turned immediately toward the window. Through the blowing snow outside, headlights moved slowly between the trees below the ridge. One vehicle, black SUV, climbing toward the cabin. The black SUV crawled through the snowfall below the ridge like a shadow moving between the trees. Its headlights cut across the forest in slow pale beams before stopping near the base of the cabin path. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire suddenly felt thinner, colder. Rex stood beside Daniel now, body tense despite the exhaustion weighing heavily on his old frame. Low growls rolled softly from his chest while his eyes stayed fixed on the window. Daniel did not move at first. He simply stared into the storm beyond the glass with the expression of a man who had spent years expecting ghosts to eventually find him. Ethan stepped closer to the window. Friends of yours? Daniel answered quietly without looking away. No. The porch light flickered once overhead as wind pushed harder against the cabin walls. Then car doors opened below the ridge. 2 figures stepped out wearing dark winter jackets and boots heavy enough to crunch through the deep snow. One carried a flashlight. The other held a folder tucked beneath his arm. They started climbing slowly toward the cabin. Ethan turned back toward Daniel. You expecting visitors? Daniel gave a faint shake of his head. Nobody knows this place exists. Rex suddenly barked once. Sharp. Warning. The sound echoed through the cabin and disappeared into the storm outside. One of the men below paused immediately at the noise. Ethan noticed it right away. Military posture. Controlled movement. Not tourists. Not lost hikers. Daniel stood slowly from the table and moved toward a shelf near the fireplace. Instead of reaching for a weapon, he picked up an old Marine field jacket hanging from a wooden hook. The faded fabric still carried his captain insignia stitched near the collar. Ethan frowned slightly. You still keep that? Daniel slid the jacket on carefully. Some parts of you survive, even when the rest does not. Snow swirled against the windows harder now. The footsteps outside grew closer. Rex moved in front of Daniel instinctively despite the pain in his joints. Old habits. Old loyalty. Ethan noticed Daniel's hand resting gently against the shepherd's back, like muscle memory returning after years asleep. Then came 3 slow knocks at the cabin door. Nobody spoke immediately. Fire crackled softly behind them, while wind rattled the porch railing outside. Finally, Daniel opened the door halfway. Cold air rushed instantly into the cabin carrying snowflakes and the scent of pine. The older of the 2 men removed his gloves slowly. Gray hair, military haircut, calm eyes that had seen too many classified things. He looked directly at Daniel for a long silent moment. Captain Hayes, the man said quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Nobody calls me that anymore. The man glanced briefly toward Rex, standing protectively nearby. Something softened across his face for half a second. Recognition. Seems your dog disagreed. Ethan stayed near the fireplace, watching carefully. The second man handed the older one the folder. No aggression. No raised voices. Somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. Who are you? Ethan finally asked. The older man reached slowly into his coat pocket and removed a military identification badge. Department of Defense. Special Operations Recovery Division. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The man looked back toward Daniel again. We have been searching for you for a very long time. Daniel laughed once under his breath, tired and hollow. That is funny. Your people spent 8 years pretending I was dead. Snow blew across the porch between them. The older man lowered his eyes briefly before answering. Because after Black Ridge, somebody inside the operation wanted you erased. Silence swallowed the doorway. Then the man opened the folder slowly and revealed a photograph clipped inside. Ethan stepped closer. The image showed 3 younger Marines standing beside a military transport vehicle overseas. Daniel, Ethan, and another handler neither of them had seen in years. Marcus Reed. Ethan stared hard at the picture. Marcus died before extraction. The older man looked up slowly. No, he said quietly. Marcus Reed is the reason Black Ridge happened. Rex growled again immediately. The cabin fell silent except for the fire snapping softly inside the stove and the wind sweeping snow across the porch outside. Rex stood rigid beside Daniel, his growl low and steady now, the sound vibrating deep through his aging chest the moment Marcus Reed's name entered the room. Ethan stared at the photograph inside the folder while old memories surfaced beneath the haze of passing years. Marcus had been sharp, charismatic, the kind of Marine who could make exhausted men laugh during the worst nights overseas. He handled explosives, new routes, new schedules, trusted by everyone inside the unit, including Daniel, especially Daniel. The older government agent stepped carefully into the cabin and brushed snow from his coat. My name is Walter Grayson, he said quietly. I was assigned to internal recovery after Black Ridge. Daniel shut the cabin door behind them with controlled calm, though Ethan noticed his hands trembling slightly beneath the lantern light. Recovery, Daniel repeated softly. That is an interesting word for burying people alive. Walter lowered his eyes for a brief second before continuing. The official story blamed enemy reconnaissance for the compromised mission, but that was never true. Snow tapped softly against the windows while shadows moved across the cabin walls. Ethan folded his arms tightly. You were saying Marcus sold them out? Walter nodded once. Not for ideology. Money. The word landed heavily in the room. Daniel stared toward the fire without blinking. No, Walter removed another document from the folder and laid it carefully across the table. Bank transfers. Offshore accounts. Dates matching the weeks before Black Ridge. Ethan felt anger tighten inside his chest slowly like a fist. Marcus died during extraction, Ethan said again. Walter shook his head. He disappeared before the operation collapsed. We spent years tracking him. Daniel remained motionless near the stove. Rex slowly moved closer beside him until the old shepherd's body rested against Daniel's leg, as if sensing the storm building beneath his silence. Why tell me now? Daniel finally asked. Walter looked directly at him. Because 3 months ago Marcus Reed resurfaced in Montana. Ethan's head snapped upward instantly. Walter continued. He has been buying remote land throughout Bitterroot County using false identities. We believe he is preparing to disappear permanently. Daniel let out a slow breath through his nose and sat heavily in the chair beside the fire. Exhaustion washed across his face. I do not care about revenge. Walter nodded slightly. That is why I came. The firelight flickered across the old agent's lined face. Marcus recently learned you survived Black Ridge. Silence. Heavy and immediate. Ethan felt the temperature in the room drop despite the heat from the stove. Walter looked toward Rex briefly before speaking again. 2 weeks ago, someone broke into an archived military kennel facility asking questions about retired K-9 units. Daniel's hand tightened gently against Rex's fur. He was looking for Rex. Walter nodded. Your dog became a liability the moment he started tracking your scent again. Rex lifted his head slowly at the sound of his name, eyes moving between the men as though understanding far more than they wished he could. Outside, the wind rose sharply against the cabin walls. Ethan looked toward Daniel. He came after the only witness that could still find you. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Years of isolation suddenly made terrible sense now. The hidden records, the erased identity, the constant fear. Not paranoia. Survival. Then Rex suddenly limped toward the cabin window and stared into the darkness beyond the snow-covered trees. His ears lifted sharply forward again. Ethan stepped closer beside him. At first he saw nothing except blowing snow and pine shadows moving in the wind. Then distant lights appeared far below the ridge. More vehicles this time. 3 of them. The 3 vehicles moved slowly through the storm below the ridge, their headlights drifting across the trees like pale ghosts beneath the falling snow. Inside the cabin, nobody spoke for several long seconds. The fire crackled softly while Rex remained fixed at the window, every instinct inside the old shepherd suddenly awake again despite the years weighing on his body. Ethan could hear the faint rumble of engines climbing closer through the mountain road. Walter Grayson stepped toward the window beside him and narrowed his eyes into the darkness. "That is not government," he said quietly. Daniel stood near the stove with one hand resting against the back of a chair, his face unreadable now. Not fear. Recognition. The kind that came from surviving too long. "Marcus found me," he murmured. Snow swirled harder outside as the lights disappeared briefly behind a cluster of pines. Ethan turned toward Daniel sharply. "How?" Daniel glanced down toward Rex. "Because he knew the only thing still loyal enough to search for me was the dog." The truth settled heavily inside the cabin. Rex had not just reunited with Daniel. He had exposed him. The old shepherd looked back toward Daniel as though apologizing without understanding why love could ever become dangerous. Daniel crossed the room slowly and knelt beside him. His weathered hands moved gently through Rex's silvered fur while the storm pressed against the windows around them. "Hey," he whispered softly. "None of this is your fault." Rex leaned into him immediately with a tired sigh. Ethan looked away briefly toward the fire because some forms of loyalty hurt too much to witness directly. Walter opened the folder again and removed a folded map marked with handwritten circles through Bitterroot County. "Marcus has been tracking old military contacts for months," he explained quietly. "Retired handlers. K-9 facilities. Veterans connected to Black Ridge." Ethan frowned. Why now after all these years? Walter hesitated before answering. Because Daniel was never the target. Silence filled the cabin again. Daniel slowly lifted his head. Walter continued carefully. Black Ridge was supposed to destroy operational evidence tied to illegal weapons transfers. Marcus was part of the arrangement. But Rex disrupted extraction timing during the storm that night. Ethan felt cold move slowly beneath his skin despite the heat from the fire. Walter looked toward the shepherd. That dog saved more lives than anyone realized. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Memory flickered across his face now like distant lightning. Sandstorms. Radios. Snow mixing with smoke. Rex barking somewhere through the chaos. "He pulled me out," Daniel whispered. "I remember that now." The old shepherd rested his head against Daniel's chest quietly, as though he had been waiting years for the memory to finally return. Outside, engines stopped below the ridge. Doors opened. Muffled voices drifted faintly through the storm. Walter immediately lowered the lantern flame inside the cabin until shadows swallowed most of the room. "We do not have much time." Ethan looked around the small cabin quickly. "How many exits?" "Back trail through the creek," Daniel answered automatically. Military instincts returning piece by piece now. But Rex cannot handle another long hike in this weather. Everyone looked toward the old German shepherd lying beside the fire. His breathing had grown heavier during the last hour. Age. Exhaustion. Miles of snow-covered mountains finally catching up to him. Daniel's expression tightened painfully. "I am not leaving him." Then something unexpected happened. Rex slowly pushed himself upright and limped toward the rear hallway leading deeper into the cabin. He stopped once and looked back at Daniel. "Waiting." Ethan frowned. "What is he doing?" Daniel stared at the dog for a long moment before sudden realization crossed his face. "No," he whispered. Rex barked once sharply and disappeared down the hallway. Daniel immediately followed. Ethan and Walter exchanged confused looks before hurrying after them. At the end of the narrow hallway, Rex stood beside an old wooden trapdoor partially hidden beneath a rug. The old trapdoor creaked softly beneath Daniel's hands as he pulled back the rug covering it. Dust drifted upward into the dim hallway light, while cold air rose faintly from the darkness below. Rex stood beside the opening, breathing hard but steady, his tail still now as though he understood exactly how little time remained. Outside, distant footsteps crunched through the snow near the cabin porch. Voices carried faintly beneath the storm. Ethan knelt beside the trapdoor and aimed his flashlight downward. Wooden steps disappeared into a narrow underground passage reinforced with old support beams and stone walls. "You built this?" he whispered. Daniel nodded once. "Years ago, in case somebody eventually came looking." Walter glanced toward the front of the cabin where floorboards groaned softly beneath the wind. "Then tonight was always going to happen." Daniel looked down at Rex again, understanding settling quietly across his face now. He remembered the tunnel. Ethan frowned slightly. "How?" Daniel gave a tired half-smile while brushing a hand gently along the old shepherd's neck. "Because I trained him to." Memory returned to him more clearly now with every passing hour. Ethan could see it happening in real time. The posture, the voice, the old Marine captain slowly waking beneath years of buried trauma and isolation. Daniel reached beneath the staircase and pulled free a weatherproof storage case covered in dust. Inside sat old military radios, emergency supplies, and several sealed folders wrapped carefully in plastic. Walter's eyes widened immediately. "You kept the evidence." Daniel looked at him calmly. "I kept the truth." Snow hammered suddenly against the cabin windows above them. Then came the sound of a vehicle door slamming outside. Closer this time. Ethan's pulse quickened. Walter checked the pistol holstered beneath his coat, but did not remove it. Nobody in the room wanted violence. Not after surviving so much already. Daniel closed the storage case again and handed it to Ethan. "If something happens, you get this to the recovery division." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No, we leave together." Daniel looked toward Rex lying near the trapdoor now, his breathing heavier than before. The old shepherd's eyes remained fixed only on Daniel. "He cannot make another mountain run tonight," Daniel said quietly. "And I am not abandoning him again." Silence filled the hallway. Ethan swallowed hard because he finally understood what this reunion had truly cost. Rex crossed states in winter storms to save the man who once saved him. One final mission carried by loyalty alone. Walter stepped closer. "There is still time if we move now." But Daniel shook his head gently. "No more running." Outside, Boots climbed onto the porch. Wood creaked overhead. Ethan could hear muffled voices beyond the front door now. Rex slowly struggled back onto his paws despite the pain shaking through his body. Daniel immediately knelt beside him. "Easy, partner." The old shepherd pressed his head weakly against Daniel's chest. Then something soft changed in Daniel's expression. Peace. For the first time since Ethan arrived at the cabin, the fear seemed gone from his eyes. "You know what the strange thing is?" Daniel whispered quietly while stroking Rex's fur. "For years I thought war took everything from me." Snow hissed softly against the roof above them. "Turns out, it left me one soul that never stopped coming home." Ethan looked away toward the darkness below the trapdoor because emotion tightened painfully in his throat. Then suddenly the front door upstairs opened. Cold wind swept through the cabin overhead, followed by heavy footsteps entering the room. Silence. A man's voice echoed faintly from above. Older now. Colder. "Daniel." Rex's ears lifted instantly at the sound. Low growling rolled through the hallway again. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second before standing slowly beside the old German shepherd. "Marcus," he said quietly. The cabin stood silent beneath the storm while snow buried the porch rails inch by inch beneath the pale Montana night. Daniel climbed the narrow hallway steps slowly with Rex beside him, the old German shepherd limping heavily now but refusing to stay behind. Ethan and Walter followed close behind, carrying the evidence case from beneath the trapdoor. The fire still burned low inside the main room, casting long shadows across the walls where old photographs and military maps trembled softly in the wind slipping through the opened front door. Marcus Reed stood near the entrance with snow melting across the shoulders of his dark coat. Age had touched him too, gray at the temples, harder eyes. But Ethan recognized the same smooth, calm Marcus always carried during deployments overseas. The kind of calm that hid dangerous things beneath it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Wind pushed through the doorway, carrying the smell of pine and winter smoke. Then Marcus looked down at Rex, standing beside Daniel, and gave a quiet shake of his head. That dog always did ruin plans. Rex growled low again, weak but unwavering. Daniel rested one hand gently against the shepherd's neck. You should leave. Marcus looked around the cabin slowly, his eyes stopping briefly on the old photograph hanging near the fireplace. 3 young Marines smiling beneath a desert sun before war hollowed them out. You know, Marcus said quietly, I almost came back for you after Black Ridge. Ethan clenched his jaw instantly, but Daniel remained still. Almost is a dangerous word. Marcus lowered his eyes for a second. Things got bigger than I expected. Silence filled the room again. No shouting. No threats. Just tired men standing inside the ruins of old choices. Walter stepped forward slightly. It is over, Marcus. Marcus laughed faintly under his breath. Nothing ever ends clean in our world. Then his gaze returned to Daniel. I heard you lost your memory. Thought maybe the mountains buried the rest. Daniel glanced down at Rex. The old shepherd leaned quietly against his leg, breathing slower, now near the warmth of the fire. No, Daniel said softly. He brought it back. Marcus studied the dog for a long moment. Something complicated moved across his face then. Regret perhaps, or shame too old to carry anymore. Outside, the storm finally began to calm. Snow drifted softer now against the windows. Marcus slowly removed a folded envelope from inside his coat and placed it carefully onto the table near the fire. Everything is in there, he said quietly. Names, accounts, operations. Walter stared at him cautiously. Why surrender now? Marcus looked toward Rex again. Because dogs do not know how to betray people. The room fell silent once more. Marcus stepped backward toward the open door, snow swirling around him beneath the porch light. I spent years convincing myself survival mattered more than loyalty, he said. Then an old shepherd crossed half the country just to find the man everybody else abandoned. Daniel said nothing. He only kept one hand resting against Rex's fur while the fire crackled softly beside them. Marcus gave one final nod before disappearing into the snowstorm outside. The sound of engines faded slowly down the mountain road until only wind remained. Hours later, dawn finally touched Bitterroot Ridge with pale gold light spilling gently across the frozen trees. The storm had passed. Ethan stood outside the cabin porch holding a cup of coffee while Walter radioed recovery teams down in the valley. Inside the cabin, quiet peace settled at last. Daniel sat on the floor beside the fire wrapped in an old wool blanket. Rex rested against his chest, asleep now, his breathing slow and shallow but calm. Daniel stroked the silver fur along the old shepherd's neck carefully like a man trying to thank someone for saving his soul without words. Sunlight warmed the cabin windows while snow sparkled across the mountains beyond. Ethan watched silently from the doorway as Daniel lowered his forehead gently against Rex's. No soldier left behind, he whispered softly. The old German shepherd's tail moved once against the floor. Just once. Then the cabin became still again beneath the morning light.